This is the full story of how the general officer commanding the 3rd Division in Jos, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, overthrew Alhaji Shehu Usman Aliyu Shagari, the President and Commander-in-Chief of the Nigerian Armed Forces, on December 31, 1983. In September 1978, the head of state, Lieutenant General Olusegun lifted the ban on political party activity that had been in force since Sunday, January 16, 1966, when Nigeria's first military head of state, Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, made his maiden speech to the nation. Obasanjo's lifting of the political ban was in anticipation of the return to civil rule on October 1, 1979, after 13 years, 3 months, and 15 days. However, during that period, Nigeria had seen clear political and military changes where the country was ruled by 4 military rulers: Generals Aguiyi-Ironsi, Yakubu Gowon, Murtala Muhammad, and Olusegun Obasanjo. It also split from the 4 regions of North, East, West, and Midwest, which the military inherited, to the 19 states it would hand over to the civilians. Nigeria was now a much bigger country in terms of administration. During the 13-year, 3-month, and 15-day rule of the military, the Tiv and Western regional crisis had been solved. The Isaac Adakaboro-led rebellion had been crushed, and the 30-month civil war had been fought after Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, the military governor of the Eastern region, declared the breakaway Republic of Biafra. The military government of Yakubu Gowon reversed the army's demography as seen in the 1950s and 1960s, when many servicemen of Igbo origin were denied recruitment into the army. The reasons were obvious, of course. The military also decided to move the federal capital from Lagos to Abuja, change the country's national anthem, and do away with the British parliamentary system of the First Republic to an American-styled presidential system of government and a new constitution. Petrodollars and the swift growth in the economy followed the discovery of crude oil. It gave rise to a new fast-growing urban middle class with fresh ideals. The peaceful rural landscape of the early 1960s was about to be shaken up. Large-scale new facilities, as well as increased military bases, were constructed to support many aspects of the economy. The 3rd and 2nd National Development Plans were finished. New barracks appeared all over the place. The uniforms of the military had changed. An abundance of surplus American trucks from the Vietnam War had been imported by the army. An attempted coup in 1976 resulted in the enactment of new laws aimed at combating coup plots, which in turn led to executions. It was the 3rd time since 1966 that Nigerian soldiers would kill the head of the Nigerian government. General Gowon, Nigeria's Civil War era leader who was studying political science in the United Kingdom at the time, was accused, tried in absentia, and dismissed from the army. He was eventually pardoned and had his ranks restored in 1982. The army now possessed tanks and long-range artillery, and the Command and Staff College had been established. As part of the United Nations force, it was now sending peacekeeping battalions to Lebanon. This was the unit's first overseas deployment since returning from battalion operations in Tanzania in November 1964. It was even conducting a second peacekeeping mission in Chad. It had modified educational criteria for recruits and initiated an active demobilization program. All states received equal representation this time around, although the quota system remained in place. Given that there were 10 states in the north and 9 in the south, the North's overall proportion of officers and recruits had risen from 50% to 52.6% since 1966. The Midwest percentage had also somewhat increased, going from 4% to 5.3%, even if the region's re-representation, Bamidele, had momentarily increased due to recruitment during the Civil War. After having 25% before 1966, the East now shared roughly 21% between the first 3 states and 4 states, 2 of which were non-Igbo. The West share was stable at about 21%, but this time, Yoruba men were signing up and joining the army, a far cry from the situation in the 1950s and early 60s. Since its establishment by a parliamentary act in 1964, the Air Force had emerged as a formidable force. It stopped using the rank insignia of the army. The Navy was a far larger organization now. Even a dockyard was present. In addition, the police were far bigger and more intricate. British police officers had ceased to exist. Where none had existed, a National Security Organization (NSO) had been established. In the interim, 3 new institutions were founded: an Administrative Staff College, an Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, and the National Institute for International Affairs. Those civilians who were voting for the first time at age 18 in 1979 were only 4 years old when the First Republic fell and were too young to even remember that Nigeria once had a civilian government. Because of the land use decree, there has even been a change in land tenure in southern Nigeria. Large swaths of land for barracks and potential military training may now be purchased without the ruthless community demands for compensation that were previously the norm, which had significant military implications. The military was no longer merely a ceremonial force that carried out civilian-made security and defense plans. This was a self-assured and victorious military that had won a war, held the nation together, and then executed a plan for the restoration of civil government with success. It was an active participant in the creation and execution of policy and a fairly serious combat force in West Africa. Leading supporters of military rule in Nigeria like Lieutenant General Theophilus Danjuma, the then chief of the army, even went so far as to claim that military dictatorship was the norm. Formerly infrequent in the 1960s, soldiers were now often interacting with people in the town and occasionally refused to pay rent on rental houses. It was usual to see signposts with the words, "Military Zone, keep moving," in front of military installations, evoking the dark days of the Nigerian Civil War. The foreign affairs scene had also changed. The games of cat and mouse that Kwame Nkrumah and Tafawa Balewa used to play were over. Ghana had undergone military control and was not the same nation as it had been in the 1960s. Nkrumah was toppled a few weeks after he had applauded the Nigerian coup in January 1966. For economic reasons, a large number of Ghanaians had, in fact, gone to Nigeria both legally and illegally. Nigeria had grown to be a significant force in the anti-apartheid struggle and politics in South Africa. Over concerns from the United States, the country had recognized the MPLA party in Angola and nationalized British Petroleum over Rhodesia. The Nigerian military also trained a few nationalist guerrillas. Since 1970, steadily rising tensions over the Bakassi border with Cameroon had become the norm. Another hotspot was the Chad Basin. Nigeria's colonial master, Britain, had the lowest level of diplomatic relations with the country due to a misunderstanding over the unsuccessful Dimka coup attempt in 1976. In order to promote the envisioned new civil-military interaction, additional entities were developed in the 1979 Constitution. The elected president would now have a more straightforward command structure, serving as the ceremonial head, commander-in-chief, and head of state all in one. There would be a vice president for the president. The president would preside over separate councils for security and defense. The councils of the Army, Navy, and Air Force continued to operate. In addition to the Minister of Defense's policy line of responsibility, the newly established Office of Chief of Defense Staff was intended to serve as the primary military operational advisor, providing direct access to the president. Nigeria now had the chiefs of the Air, Navy, and Army staff. In the Army, there were 3 divisions and a garrison organization, each with its own general officer commanding GOC, rather than 5 battalions under one GOC. Upon Nigeria's independence in 1960, the incoming service chiefs were not even commissioned. Furthermore, a large number of middle-grade officers had never served under civilians in their professional careers. Among the political elites, the old and well-known faces were still around. While they were still alive and kicking, Obafemi Awolowo and Nnamdi Azikiwe were interested in active politics. Also, former employees of the Northern People's Congress (NPC) were around. 5 new political parties had emerged, all of which needed to register and stick to tight regulations. With some additions from the former Action Group (AG), National Council of Nigerian Citizens (NCNC), and the United Middle Belt Congress (UMBC), the National Party of Nigeria (NPN) was essentially a resuscitation of the NPC-NNDP First Republic coalition. For the most part, the AG was reborn as the Unity Party of Nigeria (UPN). In many ways, the Nigerian People's Party (NPP) was the NCNC reborn. Also, the Northern Element Progressive United (NEPU) reincarnated as the People's Redemption Party (PRP). Alhaji Waziri Ibrahim of Borno led a splinter organization called the Great Nigerian People's Party (GNPP). All political parties were now required to exhibit geographic spread in order to win the center, but fundamental political principles and practices remained the same. The National Assembly, which was bicameral, that is, the Senate and the House of Representatives, was now set up as an American-style committee system. The Senate and the House would now have oversight committees for intelligence, defense, and law enforcement, that is, the police. In the run-up to the elections in August 1979, soldiers may vote but could not be voted for, and they were banned from openly participating in elections or supporting political parties. It was forbidden to make political speeches, write articles without permission, or run political campaigns in barracks according to antiquated laws dating back to the First Republic. Many former ministers and governors were not among the officers who were required to leave from active duty. Instead, it was officers who had held very senior governing posts or fostered political ambition. These officers, which included the majority of the northern officers who had deposed General Yakubu Gowon in July 1975, reintegrated into the military to wait for the right opportunity to return. However, the 1979 Constitution had a clause that declared the seizure of power to be unconstitutional. In an environment of competitive zero-sum party politics, it was envisaged that such measures would create safe borders between civil and military life and lessen ethno-regional tensions. However, statements made in public by party officials served to indicate who would be pro-military and who were anti-military. Thus, Shagari's NPN was preferred as it considered the military as the only credible alternative against the other 4 political parties. The statement, "There are only 2 parties in Nigeria, the NPN and the military," was a popular saying in Nigeria's Second Republic. However, the professional officers in the Nigerian army found the statement distasteful. General Olusegun Obasanjo's outgoing military government nominated a new army chief for the incoming civilian government, but the office of the Chief of Defense Staff remained vacant. Additionally, the office of Deputy Chief of Army Staff was created. Thus, Generals Alani Akinrinade and Gibson Jallo became the first Chief and Deputy Chief of Army Staff in the new Shagari administration. The 1979 elections, like the ones held 20 years earlier in 1959, were not without controversy. According to the 1979 Constitution, the winning party that forms the government must receive at least 25% of the total votes cast in 2/3 of the states, in addition to the majority of the total votes. If not, there was going to be a second round of voting in the Electoral College. Determining the precise meaning of 2/3 of 19 states became the challenge. Although opponents claimed the National Party of Nigeria (NPN) did not meet the requirements because it did not receive 25% of the votes cast in 13 states in the first round of voting, the party did come closest to the ideal of the constitution. In the eyes of the outgoing military regime, which was keen to prevent a crisis during the Electoral College, the NPN's geographic spread across 12 states and 25% of the 13 states was sufficient. Thus, the battle lines were drawn. Chief Obafemi Awolowo brought the case to the Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled in favor of Shagari's NPN. The Yoruba leader refused to accept the ruling of Nigeria's Apex Court until his death on May 9, 1987. Just before October 1, 1979, the NPN's opponents attempted a legislative coup, and the newly elected civilian government had to repel both this legal battle and the Federal Electoral Commission's declaration of the party as the winner of the election. On October 2, 1979, at the inauguration, the UPN, GNPP, and NPP decided to use their combined parliamentary majority to seize control of the National Assembly. General Obasanjo withdrew the constitutionally mandated inauguration date in discussions with the departing military regime, giving Shagari enough time to counter-propose to his opponents and form a government of national unity. President Shehu Shagari met with high-ranking military officers shortly after he finally took office. Instead of designating a civilian minister of defense, the senior military officers conveyed their desire for the president to continue holding the defense portfolio. However, Shagari refused. Instead, he appointed 44-year-old Iya Abubakar, a retired professor of mathematics at the Bamidele University, Zaria, as the civilian minister of defense. Abubakar was an Adamawa-born Fulani, just like Muhammadu Buhari during the First Republic. But in October 1982, for unknown reasons, Shagari took over Professor Iya Abubakar's portfolio as defense minister for the rest of his first term. The opposition saw this as a step forward, using the military for party purposes in the incoming 1983 elections. After winning a second term in 1983, President Shehu Shagari then appointed an Ilorin-based lawyer and businessman, Akombioni Yongi, as the second Minister of Defense. However, Shagari did not designate ministers of state for specific ministries, as was done during the First Republic. In addition, the president consented to wear a military uniform whenever he was carrying out only military state duties for the psychological benefits of the armed forces. President Nnamdi Azikiwe had also done this during the First Republic. It might have been a colonial custom originating from the quasi-military background of the majority of British governors-general. Shagari generally used Umaru Shinkafi, the Director General of the National Security Organization (NSO), as a go-between in his non-confrontational approach to negotiations with the army. Along with these delicate trips, Shinkafi also paid visits to two well-known exiles, Yakubu Gowon and Emeka Ojukwu, during the negotiations for their individual state pardons. Clearly, the army needed to be handled delicately in this sensitive matter. Early on in the administration, Shagari discovered that the military had maintained direct access to the president, approving certain issues under the guise of security reasons without consulting the legislature or the council of ministers. The task force method of accomplishing things frequently resulted in the absence of a contract tendering procedure, especially for barracks. Therefore, everything had to be standardized in line with ordinary civil service procedures. This was a correct approach, but it also had some detrimental effects on the relationship between the civilians and the military. For instance, in late 1982, a civilian defense contractor named Buka Mandara started plotting to support a military coup after being denied access to certain benefits he had previously enjoyed while serving in the military. After being apprehended, prosecuted, and imprisoned, he was only freed on a technicality when federal prosecutors decided to try him in a federal high court, circumventing the legal process out of fear that the opposition UPN-controlled Lagos State judiciary system would attempt to disgrace the federal government. Seven months after taking office in April 1980, the newly elected president started a delicate game of musical chairs in the high command. Shagari promoted Jallo to the position of army chief, kicked Akinrinade to the constitutionally required but powerless position of Chief of Defense Staff (CDS), and named General Nwa Wushishi from his geopolitical zone, who was then the commandant of the Staff College, as the deputy chief of army staff. 2 years after taking office in October 1981, President Shagari finally made his move, promoting Wushishi to the delicate post of Chief of Army Staff, kicking Jallo upstairs to CDS, and expressing gratitude to the retiring General Akinrinade for his services to the country. After that, Shagari gave his trusted army chief all responsibility for internal postings of officers and paid very little attention to anything other than a brigade of guards. He even cautioned one of his ministers, Muhammadu Buhari, not to provoke the military by meddling too much in their internal issues. When Brigadier Buhari, having recently returned from a course in the United States, clashed with General Wushishi on his posting to the army, Shagari declined to intervene. This strategy was exposed on December 31, 1983, when the president was fleeing from rebel troops that had stormed the presidential lodge in Abuja. He was unable to identify the officer, Brigadier Sani Abacha, who had announced the coup over the radio, or pinpoint his ethnic background. Abacha, a far northerner like the president and a Kanuri originally from Borno, but born in adjacent Kano State, commanded the vital 9th Brigade in Ikeja Cantonment, close to the federal capital. Major General Joseph Nalven Garba, the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Nigeria, did, however, have his military career terminated by the Shagari administration. With his wide range of international contacts, Garba was larger than life. Additionally, he was the previous commander of the Brigade of Guards that removed General Gowon from office in 1975, together with others. It is possible that Garba's decision to retire was influenced by the perception that he was an unreliable military politician. However, a large number of those who remained in service had also participated in the same coup of July 1975. Wushishi, for example, then deputy commandant of the School of Infantry, was the officer who had been sent in a plane around the country to gather senior military officers for the first post-coup meeting in Lagos, which the troika of Murtala Mohammed, Olusegun Obasanjo, and Theophilus Danjuma were chosen to lead. In the past, Wushishi served as the federal minister. Babangida, a lieutenant colonel who subsequently became Wushishi's de facto deputy, participated in the July 1975 coup as the 4th Race Regiment's commander and a member of the Supreme Military Council. By some coincidence, as of the time of the coup that eventually removed him, the President and Commander-in-Chief Shehu Shagari, the Chief of Army Staff Inuwa Wushishi, the Director of Army Staff Duties and Plans Ibrahim Babangida, the Quartermaster General Mamman Vatsa, the Commander Brigade of Guards Bello Kaliel, the Director of Military Intelligence Aliyu Mohammed, and the Director of the NSO Umaru Shinkafi were all from the part of Nigeria we now call the Northwest Geopolitical Zone. It is possible that these civil-military arrangements gave the president a false sense of security. In fact, the civilian government of the Second Republic threw itself into managing the acquisition, reorganization, and demobilization of defense. It was marketed as a political move towards the country's eastern region, but may have been motivated by cold military calculations. As a result, a new army division known as 82 Division with airborne, air mobile and amphibious brigades was established and stationed at Enugu. It divided the naval flotilla into naval commands and established new air force commands and staff branches. The Shagari administration purchased brand new warships, bombers and jet fighters. In January 1983, the Nigerian Defense Academy started issuing degrees. As the National Institute of Policy and Strategic Studies (NIPSS) was growing, the Army Command and Staff College was transformed into a tri-service organization. The matter of delays in the demobilized soldiers' benefits payments was one touchy subject. If a demobilized soldier has not received his benefits, the president issued an order prohibiting him from being compelled to leave the barracks. The Gowon military regime from 1966 to 1975 was reluctant to handle the demobilization exercise quickly, in part because of its sensitivity. For starters, a large number of people enlisted during the Civil War originated from regions of the nation home to ethnic minorities that had little natural resources and dwindling financial incentives for farming. There was no economic net into which they could be placed safely without fear of political or military backlash when it came time to discharge them. They were therefore kept in part as a social service, but perhaps not unmindful of the fact that they were part of the ethno-military political base of the then Commander-in-Chief, General Gowon. When then Brigadier Murtala Mohammed came to power in July 1975, his new army chief, then Brigadier Danjuma, took the demobilization issue by the horns. The new civilian leaders were well aware that this was one of the grievances behind the abortive coup of February 1976, in which General Murtala Mohammed lost his life. It has been reported that over the 10-year period from 1976 to 1986, the military declined in size from 230,000 to 94,000 personnel. None of these necessarily meant that the country was less militarized. Trained soldiers with a military mentality were merely displaced from one sector to another. Within the military itself as an institution, democratization had very superficial roots. The new civilian regime also moved quickly to review conditions of military service when it introduced the national minimum wage. It continued certain reorganizational initiatives that started during the previous regime. This had, however, been motivated primarily by service considerations with no public inputs. The Shagari administration started the process of bringing the dormant Defense Industries Corporation back to life. The corporation had been founded in 1964 during the First Republic. The military ordered the establishment of 2 truck assembly plants which had been planned by the previous government and ordered that all truck needs be met locally. The Air Force brought interceptors, deep interdictions and ground assault jets, while the Navy bought helicopters, patrol boats and frigates. The military offered expert suggestions for these purchases and the civilians gave their approval. It is interesting to note that President Shagari chose to give the Air Force control over the presidential air transport fleet, which had previously only been owned by Nigeria Airways. However, it appears that there was no reciprocation of Shagari's trust. After learning of the December 1983 coup plots, certain Air Force officers in the presidential fleet attempted to use fake weather forecasts to divert the president's aircraft from Abuja to Kaduna, where Brigadier Bako was waiting in the wings. The president originally managed to flee, but it was only his refusal to be sidetracked that ended the particular phase of the coup, which eventually succeeded. Concurrently, as one might anticipate in a conventional process of transitional demilitarization, the president took steps to strengthen the police. The Ministry of Police Affairs was created, while police depots and colleges expanded. New barracks were constructed, new equipment were built, salaries were raised, and the uniform was changed. But all of these merely served to create envy in certain circles among the military, which even interpreted the arming of the police as a ploy to fight the army, rather than reduce the reliance on the military for internal security. During the Shagari administration, Nigeria was involved in 3 major external conflicts: Cameroon, Lebanon, and Chad. By October 1979, when the new civilian government took power, the armed forces were already heavily involved in Lebanon and Chad. It then became embroiled in a grave boundary dispute with Cameroon. In fact, Nigeria's boundary dispute with Cameroon was first mentioned in the Anglo-German Treaty of 1913. Some Nigerian soldiers who were guarding the Akpayafi River were attacked and killed by Cameroonian soldiers on May 16, 1981. However, Cameroon asserted that their soldiers had been on the Rio de Rey, which is located deep within the country. The president demanded an apology from Cameroon and requested an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. President Shagari ordered mobilization and operational planning for a potential military reaction in response to growing public and army fury. Under the direction of Brigadier Vatsa, a joint task force was fully mobilized throughout the frontier. Behind the scenes, blunt diplomatic efforts persisted. The president was required by constitutional provisions to request authorization from the National Assembly prior to openly declaring war. However, Shagari was unable to ensure that any overtures to the legislature would be kept confidential due to the level of animosity within the political elites. In order to appease domestic military and public resentments, Shagari decided to order the full deployment of troops while applying pressure on Cameroon. Cameroon finally issued an apology, which helped to defuse the situation. However, some unknown individuals had leaked the details of the operational planning that Brigadier Vatsa had presented to the National Defense Council to French intelligence, which in turn had given it to the president of Cameroon. Next, the French played 3 cards. 1. France warned Nigeria that it had treaty obligations to defend Cameroon. 2. It warned Cameroon that it had significant interest in Nigeria and thus took the risk of being isolated if it provoked Nigeria. Finally, the French used back channels to get the Organization of African Unity (OAU) to take mediation efforts more seriously. To this day, the mechanism and motive of the leak of highly classified operational plans has never been determined. Israel launched a counter-offensive into Lebanon on March 14, 1978 under the codename Operation Litani in response to a Palestinian guerrilla attack that occurred on March 11, 1978. This led to the Lebanese government's plea to the United Nations, which resulted in the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, being sent there. In 9 battalions, Nigeria supplied more than 6,000 troops between April 1978 and January 1983. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Uwumarogie oversaw the 1st Nigerian Battalion, Naibat 1. It was the civilian government that decided to leave the UNIFIL. The Israeli invasion in June 1982 and the mess it left behind for the UN mandate were the direct causes. The government was already facing public pressure as a result of religious differences in the political class over Middle East policy in general, as well as outrage over Nigerian casualties, particularly during the mortar shelling of Naibat 6 at Al-Kamtara by Christian de facto forces in March 1981. But there were other reasons. Back in June 1979, the chief military press and information officer at the UNIFIL headquarters, Nigeria's Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Gum, was arrested, tried, convicted, and later deported by Israel for alleged gun running. This turned out to be a great source of national shame. Despite a Senate Foreign Relations Committee investigation clearing him, the army retired him. No special effort was, however, made by civilian authorities to force the military to reverse its decision. The previous Obasanjo regime sponsored a conference on Chad in March 1979, which resulted in the formation of the GUNT, a temporary government for national reconciliation. After French forces left the nation, a Nigerian unit led by Colonel Magoro Amoniwan took their place. In August, shortly before the civilian administration in Lagos took office, interim Chadian President Gukuni Wadeye urged the Nigerian units to depart. The state of affairs in Chad collapsed once more following Shagari's election. Wadeye invited Libyan forces to assist in rescuing his administration from an uprising led by Hissène Habré, his Minister of Defense. As a result, from 1982 to 1983, the OAU launched the second disastrous international peacekeeping operation known as Harmony II. Following the failure of a conference of 4 African leaders in May 1981 to formulate a plan for the evacuation of Libya and the deployment of an African peacekeeping force, France invited Nigeria and a few Francophone states to form a joint inter-African force sponsored by the OAU with French logistical support. The urgency of the situation increased when Libya declared in August that the government of Chad had consented to the union of the two nations. So, in November of that year, 6 nations, Nigeria, Senegal, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Benin, Togo, and Guinea, took on the task of forming a combined force of 6,000 soldiers to be commanded by Major General Geoffrey Ejiga of Nigeria. However, Benin, Togo, and Guinea were unable to fulfill their obligations due to financial issues. In the end, only Nigeria, Zaire, and Senegal contributed soldiers. Nigeria was mostly responsible for the $100 million cost, providing not only 3 of the 5 army battalions, but also the airlift and logistical support that other countries were unable to provide. The United States, led by President Ronald Reagan, had earlier pledged support, but declined since President Shagari was present at the 1982 OAU meeting in Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi was appointed the organization's chairman. Due to the OAU's inability to impact internal Chadian politics and the tardy deployment of an ill-equipped army with an unclear mission, Nigeria was left essentially alone in an expensive operation in forbidden territory with conditions getting worse. The Nigerian military, believing it was bound by a vague mandate, was deeply embarrassed by Hissène Habré's subsequent successful capture of the Chadian capital in N'Djamena in June 1982. With Shagari denying the Nigerian army the opportunity to invade Cameroon in 1981, the loss initiated a decline in military trust in the president's capability as the commander-in-chief. The Nigerian military had an opportunity to retaliate when Chadian troops led by Habré abruptly took control of 19 islands in Lake Chad on April 18, 1983. Brigadier Muhammadu Buhari, the general officer commanding the 3rd Division in Jos, organized the 21st Armored Brigade and unilaterally sealed the border, cutting off the supply of food and fuel to Chad. Even though he thought this was a wise practical decision, Lagos rebuked the action politically. However, Buhari disregarded all directives, including that of the president, to reopen the border. Eventually, the 21st Armored Brigade won and all captured Nigerian islands were regained, making Buhari an instant hero in the military. But in their pursuit of the Chadian trespassers, Buhari's forces crossed the border 50 kilometers into Chadian territory against strong orders not to do so. In contrast to General Douglas MacArthur of the United States, who persistently opposed President Harry Truman's Korea strategy, Buhari was neither redeployed nor dismissed for his continuous defiance of higher political authority. Disagreements over the conduct of the Chadian campaign and the inability or unwillingness of the president to enforce his authority further undermined civil-military relations and eventually contributed, among other reasons, to a successful coup on December 31, 1983, from which Buhari, a former petroleum minister and state governor in the Obasanjo regime, emerged as the new head of state. In 1980, the governor of Kano State requested that the army support the police in suppressing a radical religious insurgency organization in Kano, which was headed by a Cameroonian, Muhammadu Marwa, also known as Maitasini. After being initially stationed in Kano, the 245 Riz Battalion in Lagos had to airlift Scorpion Light armored reconnaissance vehicles to the commercial city in order to bolster the 3rd Brigade. Major General Dumuje oversaw the entire operation and reportedly told President Shagari straight out that he could not guarantee the use of minimum force, especially if any of his men were hurt or killed. At the end of the operation, major portions of Kano had been demolished and an unknown number of innocent bystander casualties had been killed, far beyond the mandate given by the president. Interestingly, similar tendencies for security forces and institutions to exceed the mandate of the democratically elected commander-in-chief were not restricted to the army. President Shagari regretted his lack of control over police abuses during the Bakolori Dam riots in his home state of Sokoto, and even the Ministry of Internal Affairs abuses during the Sugarban Daman, Wilmot, and Ghana Must Go crisis. It appears self-evident, however, that the cardinal principles of discipline, efficiency, transparency, and integrity which underpin force management were severely deficient in Nigeria's security sector in the Second Republic. Such issues continue to plague Nigeria. Numerous structural flaws, some of which resulted from the nature and scope of the 1979 electoral mandates, beset the Second Republic. The 12 opposition-controlled states, as well as the press and the MPN-dominated federal government with its 7 states did not cooperate well in zero-sum game behavior typical of Nigeria. Crucially, however, the oil boom abruptly ended in 1981, coinciding with the peaking of popular hopes for a democracy dividend and the approaching maturity of some of the jumbo loans taken out by the previous military governments. Significant interruptions resulted from these, including gaps in the salaries paid to teachers and civil personnel. Even the mass expulsion of 2 million foreign nationals, primarily from Ghana and Niger, in February 1983 was ineffective in deflecting political attention, gaining political capital, or buying time for the economic reforms outlined in the Economic Stabilization Act. At the federal and state levels, spending exceeded receipts due to the competition between parties and the distraction of election promises. Consequently, state governments accumulated a debt of 13.3 billion naira by 1983. Anyone familiar with contracts from the military era would say that corruption, smuggling, abuse of import licenses, and the sheer cost of the presidential style of government all contributed to this. Although these issues were not unique to Nigeria. Annual spits and polish parades by the Army, Navy, and Air Force, accompanied by displays of remarkable military equipment, helped to enhance the military's image as a national organization that was unaffected by political squabbling. Proposals to utilize the military to assist the 1983 presidential election process were criticized by rival parties worried about a recurrence of the events of the 1960s. Tensions concerning how much the army rather than the police would be employed for such purposes were also growing within the military. According to reports, during one of the multiple gatherings of officers to discuss army responsibilities, policies, and election strategies, Brigadier Buhari, a former state governor and federal minister, brutally told Lieutenant General Gibson Jallo, the chief of defense staff at the time, that he should inform the president that the army could no longer handle the situation. The Nigerian army attempted to sway the president's choice of government ministers soon after the elections, which were marked by the customary barrage of usually true claims of vote rigging at all levels by both parties. The army did this by handing the president their list of preferred candidates. Around this time, there were also growing indications of army discontent and coup plotting, but for some reasons, Shagari decided to deal with it off the books, once more enlisting Umaru Shinkafi as a go-between. This may have been to his naive belief that officers in his geopolitical zone would not betray him. Since it had previously been established in July 1975 that such a scenario was possible when General Gowon was overthrown by his own kinsmen, President Shagari was manifestly mistaken. There have been multiple indications that Major General Muhammadu Buhari may be involved in a coup attempt. Buhari denied twice. Seeing that his allegiance to the Shagari administration was in question, he even threatened to quit the army. However, Buhari was not the only one who was actively strategizing while appealing to regional and personal allegiance. In late October, early November 1983, Shagari received a lengthy private visit from the Director of Army Staff Duties and Plans, Brigadier Ibrahim Babangida, and the Director of Military Intelligence, Colonel Aliyu Mohammed, who were both good friends with the President and pledged their allegiance. Major Bamidele of the 3rd Division was being held at that precise moment and subjected to a fabricated trial after he naively informed his boss, Major General Buhari, in Jos about coup rumors. A few weeks later, on December 31, 1983, President Shehu Shagari was overthrown in a coup by senior northern officers he had helped nurture in the early 1960s and in whom he had placed so much trust. The ousted president had failed to learn from history. The coup took place against the backdrop of increasingly forceful public criticisms by the former military head of state, General Olusegun Obasanjo. The plotters stated that they were driven to take power in addition to the contentious 1983 elections in order to put an end to citizen corruption and economic mismanagement. Unverified sources, however, state that at least one of the military conspirators helped to finance the coup by selling import licenses they had received from Shagari's government, and that other conspirators were known to occasionally steal oil. Other reports pointed at financial contributions from a prominent Yoruba politician who was dissatisfied with his chances of becoming the presidential candidate of the MPN. In October 1983, Major Daniel Idowu Bamidele heard of coup rumors against President Shehu Shagari and promptly reported to his General Officer Commanding GOC, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who, unknown to Bamidele at that time, was in the thick of the plot. A week later, Bamidele found himself on a plane to Lagos, detained by the Directorate of Military Intelligence at Tego Barracks, and was accused of plotting a coup against Shagari. Fake witnesses were paraded and a mock interrogation was contrived while reports were being made to the National Security Organization, then under Umaru Shinkafi, to mislead the Shagari administration. Meanwhile, the real plot continued underground with the full involvement of the same military intelligence group that was interrogating him. Finally, on November 25, 1983, with no credible witness to nail him and no legal basis to charge him for a one-man conspiracy, Bamidele was released. He returned to Jos before boot about what had actually transpired until on January 1, 1984, his own General Officer Commanding Buhari, to whom he had reported the plot, emerged as the new head of state. Learning from his ordeal in 1983, the major had kept quiet about any coups. In early 1984, Bamidele's name was listed for retirement. However, when the list got to Buhari for approval, he removed his name, saying that the officer was entangled in a complicated web of intrigue. Following his last-minute rescue from retirement, Daniel Bamidele was sent to Jaji as a directing staff member. However, in 1985, the major was arrested for failing to report the alleged Vatsa coup conspiracy, tried by a special military tribunal and executed by firing squad along with others, such as Major General Mama Vatsa, on March 5, 1986. It was indeed a sad ending for the officer. Crucially, however, in his inaugural press conference, the new head of state, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, characterized his government as an offshoot of the Murtala Obasanjo regime, which had come to power in 1975 and subsequently handed over to the civilians 4 years later in 1979. Interestingly, the Buhari regime would only last for 20 months until he was overthrown by his Chief of Army Staff, Major General Ibrahim Babangida, on August 27, 1985.
I'm pleased to take this opportunity to declare once again, therefore, that this administration attaches the greatest importance to constructive and helpful criticisms as well as the freedom of the press, and to declare further that the administration also attaches the greatest importance of fundamental human rights.
You can learn more about the Babangida coup in our next episode.